everybody. Good to see you here. Thanks for being here today. Back in the 1940s and 50s, my dad grew up in East Tennessee in a town called Elizabethton, Tennessee, and he grew up on Pine Hill Road. 409 Pine Hill Road was his house where he lived with his two brothers, Jim and Dickie, and a host of other kids lived on that street whose parents worked at the local plants nearby, the North American Rayon Corporation and the J.P. Bimberg plant in Elizabethton. And that street, Pine Hill Road, wasn't too far from West Side Elementary School, where they would walk to school every day. And eventually, they'd walk to Elizabethton Middle School and Elizabethton High School. And my dad lived right next to somebody they called 98 Wilson. His real name, my dad wasn't exactly sure about. He thought maybe it was Jeff Wilson, but everybody called him 98 Wilson because he never made less than a 98 on a test throughout school. 98 Wilson. Not to be confused with our very own Joe Wilson here at CCC, who at one point in time at Perry Hall High School was called, I believe, 63 Wilson, or, something like that. 98 Wilson. One end of Pine Hill Road was what my dad and his friends called Big Piney, which was a real big steep hill at one end of the road. The other end of the road was called Little Piney because it wasn't nearly as steep, obviously. And in the winter, they'd go sledding whenever it would ice or snow, and they could really get going. They'd walk up to Big Piney and go slide down to the Little Piney side. The only problem was Pine Hill Road teed into Carter Boulevard, which was a larger road with a median in between there. And there was this concrete curb there where Carter Boulevard was. So what they do is they would pack snow up in the front of the curb to create like a little ramp. So they could sled down Pine Hill Road, up that ramp, across Carter Boulevard, and end up on the other side of Carter Boulevard where there was this playground and this ball field. And, if they had a good snow, they'd really end up there. But again, they had to sled across Carter Boulevard. So each of them took a turn. Somebody had to stay down near the road to let them know if any cars were coming at the time. And my dad said every now and again, somebody would just mess with them. There wouldn't be a car coming, but they would say, "Oh, there's a car coming," And then all the kids that were sledding, once they started on Big Piney, they'd have to bail out into people's yards along Pine Hill Road. The only problem was those yards were really tiny. They were pretty small, and the houses were like on top of each other. And so essentially, when they would bail out in somebody's yard, they're trying not to slam into their front door, It sounds a little dangerous to me, like you either took a chance on ramming into somebody's front door or you give it a go trying to cross over Carter Boulevard. Kind of like that old Atari game Frogger, or something. You're hoping you time it just right. The 50s. But my dad loved growing up on Pine Hill Road. He had all kinds of adventures on that road, made lots and lots of memories on that road, and met all kinds of people on that road, like 98 Wilson. You ever think much about the road you grew up on or live on? Or, people that you met along the way or on the road? The memories that you made or decisions that you faced on that road? I've been thinking about some specific roads lately because we started a new series last week all about roads. It's called Road Trip, and we're looking at the different specific roads that are mentioned in the Bible and the roads where people met and encountered Jesus. And we're looking at these episodes to see what happened with these folks, and we're seeing what's in store for us along the way too. And last week we looked at a road that Jesus mentioned in a story that he told, the Jericho road. And today we're going to look at that same road, actually. Something else that happened on that road to Jericho where Jesus meets somebody, and it just completely changes the trajectory of their life. So if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to get to the 19th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Now, the first 10 verses tell about this encounter along that road. And here's what we read. Jesus walked to Jericho, and as he entered, was passing through. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was. On account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. He ran ahead along the road and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give back to the poor. If I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. All right, so this week is about Jesus and this guy named Zacchaeus. And to get us rolling here, I'll ask you an occupational question. Those of you who are old enough, can you remember back to when you were growing up? Or maybe if you're growing up now, think about what you dream about or dreamed about that you might do vocationally when you grew up. Like, what did you dream about being or doing or becoming? In fact, if you're cool with this, I'd love for you to turn to the people that you're sitting next to or the people that are around you and share with them, what did you dream about doing one day when you grew up? Or if you're still growing up, what do you dream about doing when you grow up? Ready, set, go for it. Okay. So how many of you said, man, show of hands on this. How many of you said, when I grew up, I wanted to be like a fireman or police officer or state trooper or FBI agent, something like that? Anybody there? You wanted to wear something uniform or something like that? How many of you thought about and really wanted to become an artist or an actor or a singer or writer, some sort of artistic thing? Anybody? Anybody want to be a musician when they grow up? Anybody want to be a drummer? Being a drummer, yeah, drummers are cool. We got about 4 drummers in this service today, and about 20 wannabe drummers, here. How many of you dreamed about being like a doctor or nurse or surgeon, EMT, something like that, something in the healing profession? Anybody say, I want to be a teacher or a professor, something like that? Yeah. Anybody say, I want to work with animals? I want to be a vet, or a bunch of you there. How about say I wanted to be a business owner, I wanted to have my own restaurant or my own place or, whatever it is there. Anybody say I want to be an athlete or a coach, maybe something like that? Yeah. Okay, anybody here, when you were a kid, remember saying, I think when I grow up, I want to be a tax collector? Yeah, I didn't think so. Tax collectors have never been popular at any point in any society. I mean, tomorrow's tax day, right? Who's excited? Who's fired up? Tax collectors and tax collecting have just never been popular. But in Israel, in the first century, in Jesus' day, they were a whole other breed. And we talked about this before, but it's really important to understand the social stigma that came with tax collecting if we're really going to understand what's going on here in Luke 19. Tax collecting was the most dishonoring thing you could do as a way to make a living. You were seen as a traitor. See, Israel was occupied by Rome, so it wasn't free. And Rome was interested in seeing how much money they could wring out of the countries that they ruled over. And they found that it worked better if they would have local folks do it. And so they would have Israelites collect taxes for Israel. And the way that it worked is they would let people bid for the right to a certain area. and whoever got the highest bid, let's say they said, hey, I can bring in $10 million from the greater Baltimore area. They had to give Rome what they had committed, but then everything above and beyond that was just theirs. And so the system was sort of set up for tax collectors to be highly motivated to get every penny that they could out of people. They were already committed to a certain amount, but then everything over and above that was theirs. And so as a result of all this, tax collectors were just despised as traitors who had sold out their fellow people, for profit to Rome, to their occupiers. And they were seen as greedy. They were seen as dishonest. Tax collectors were so hated they were deprived of political and civil rights. They couldn't serve as witnesses in the courts. They weren't allowed to serve as judges or elders. A devout Israelite wouldn't even let a tax collector touch them. They just didn't want to be near him. They hated him. And it's important for us to understand this to really fully grasp this story. Now, an obvious question is, what would make Zacchaeus, willing to enter a profession that would create such hatred and hostility and isolation for him? Well, I have an idea, just an idea. But when you read through the story, you know that Zacchaeus had one physical characteristic prominent enough for Luke to write about it here in Luke 19. Like, for a man to be considered attractive, generally, he's supposed to have three attributes. You know what those three attributes are? Dark, handsome, and tall. That's right, tall, dark, and handsome, But Zacchaeus wasn't. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Like, he was the runt of the litter, right? Sometimes kids, growing up can be real cruel in the way that they treat people who are different, especially people who look different. And this includes being small. And it may be, we don't know, but it may be that Zacchaeus decided he would show everybody and he would become a big man in the only way he knew how, with money. And so money became the guiding force in his life. So he became a tax collector. And he wasn't just an ordinary tax collector. He was good at it. He was, Luke tells us, the chief tax collector. Did you catch that? And that is that he had other tax collectors working for him, and he was over this wide geographical area. In fact, one scholar said he was the most powerful governmental authority in and around Jericho. And because of that, he was rich. And it's fair to assume that he was thoroughly corrupt and wildly dishonest. Like, his profession meant that he had given up on society completely, on friendships, on moral decency, on integrity. He'd just given up on all that. He had ostracized himself. He was betting everything he had that affluence, that wealth and possessions were what would give him meaning and fulfillment to his life. He bet everything on that, and it wasn't working, because it never does. There was a hole in his soul that money could not fill. And then he hears that Jesus is going to come his way. Jesus is traveling to Jericho, and word spreads, and there's something about Jesus that intrigues Zacchaeus. And it's not hard to figure out what that was. Like, we could figure this out. If you look back a few chapters in the Gospel of Luke here in the Bible, in Luke 5, there's a very clear reason why Zacchaeus would have probably been intrigued by Jesus. Check it out. Verse 27 of Luke 5 says, after Jesus had done some healing, after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at a tax booth. He said to him, follow me. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. And this is a remarkable verse. Two incredible things happen here. One is that Jesus comes up to a tax collector and invites him to be a part of his group, to be a disciple of his. And the other remarkable thing is that this tax collector does it. He actually leaves everything. And then verse 29, then Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house. There was a large crowd of tax collectors sitting at the table with them. And knowing what we know about tax collectors now, we can understand this next verse. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And you'll notice those two expressions there. Tax collectors and sinners are synonymous in their mind. To be a tax collector was to be a sinner. And Jesus answered, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick do. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. All right, so that's in Luke 5, but back to Luke 19, on the road leading to Jericho, word about something like that, that happened in Luke 5 would get around. It's not the kind of incident that will be hushed up. Jesus goes to parties for tax collectors. This great moral and religious teacher and leader is going to parties for the most despised people in society. In fact, one of his followers is a former tax collector. And so Zacchaeus wants to see this guy who hangs around with people like him. What Zacchaeus doesn't know, but is about to find out, is that the arrival of Jesus to his town means that Zacchaeus is going to have to face up to the truth about his own life. And it's one of the most important parts of the story for us. It's not just about meeting Jesus. See, Jesus brings with him the truth, and we must face up to the truth about our own life very often. So Jesus is coming to Jericho. Zacchaeus wants to see him, but there's a crowd. And you think about this, like when you're a tax collector, do you want to hang out with the crowd? No, they don't want to hang out with you. You don't want to hang out with them. When you're a tax collector, you're not going to be a popular guy, and you know it. And people aren't likely to make a way and help you out so that you can see or that sort of thing. There's liable to be a fair amount of shoving and pushing and cursing for any tax collector that would be foolish enough to show up in this crowd. And Zacchaeus knows this, but he wants to see Jesus. So he climbs up to a tree, climbs up in a tree to see over this crowd. But I think he probably climbs up for another reason too. And that's to get away from the crowd. He doesn't like the crowd. The crowd doesn't like him. He doesn't like the crowd. He wants to hide. Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, but he wants to hide. And so picture what's going on. Verse 4, he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. Jesus was coming that way. And then verse 5, Jesus came to the place. All right, so put yourself in Zacchaeus' place for just a moment. Go up into that tree. Zacchaeus is sitting in that tree, and Jesus is getting closer and closer and closer. And Zacchaeus is thinking, this is a pretty good idea I had to climb this tree. I got a good view right up here. I'm probably going to get a really good look at Jesus. I may even be able to hear a fair amount of what he says. And Jesus gets closer, and all of a sudden, he's not only close, Jesus is standing right there beside that tree he climbed up in. And he's not just standing beside the tree, he's looking up into the tree. And there's this whole crowd, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who see Jesus looking up in this tree. And so they start looking up in this tree, and they start asking each other, what's Jesus looking at? They're like, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's a kid up there or something. Maybe a cat is stuck in the tree. Maybe there's a rare bird that's up there. Maybe there's a balloon stuck up there. We don't even know what a balloon is. Hasn't been invented yet. But maybe that's up there, and we're going to learn about it. Who knows? What is Jesus looking there up in that tree, looking and staring at? And then Jesus says, Zacchaeus. And that one word, his name, Zacchaeus' name, had to have set off a ripple through that crowd. Imagine how Zacchaeus feels now. He thinks he's going to hide in a tree and watch from a safe distance, and all of a sudden Jesus and everybody else in the whole world that he knows is looking up at him sitting in a tree. And the crowd's got to be buzzing now, they think that Jesus is going to blast Zacchaeus for being a corrupt tax collector. They're like, oh, yes, this is going to get bloody. It's about time that a tax collector got what's coming to him. Give it to him, Jesus. Let's go. And Jesus says, Zacchaeus, come on down out of that tree. That's the end of verse 5. Zacchaeus, hurry on and come down. And notice this, Jesus doesn't say, I want to stay at your house, or I'd like to stay at your house, or even, could I stay at your house? Jesus says, must. I must stay at your house. Luke wants us to understand by this that there is a necessity to what Jesus is doing and that God is at work behind it. And this is the kind of thing that Jesus must do in order to reveal the radical nature of the grace of God. I must do this, Jesus says. Well, Zacchaeus does it. He comes out of that tree, and he finally acknowledges the truth. Like his whole life's been built on greed and dishonesty. He sinned against his God. He sinned against his people. His life's been a miserable waste. But Zacchaeus comes out of hiding. And a crucial step in this kind of encounter of restoration, which is what this is. This is an encounter of restoration that's going on. And a crucial step is that we just got to come out of hiding. We have to see the futility of trying to evade detection, and we got to come out of hiding. It's so important for us to face up to the truth about who we are. And this can be really, really difficult because in the world that we live in, people just generally hide, don't they? They just wear masks all the time. Leading up to today, I was thinking about this story. I thought, oh, this makes sense to tell this story, but I've told this story before, several years ago here. And so I know some of you will probably remember the story. And so I wasn't going to share this story, but I got to thinking, I love this service better than all the other services. I really want you to hear the story. And so you might remember about the guy, he's desperate for a job, and he finds out that there's one available at the zoo. And so he goes there to apply. And the guy who's in charge says to him, hey, listen, we only got one position here that's open. A while back, our gorilla died when he was in captivity, and we don't have the funds to replace him with a new, authentic gorilla. So we'll pay you money to put on a gorilla suit and get in the cage and pretend to be a gorilla. And this guy's not too sure about all this because his mother didn't raise him to be a gorilla, but he's desperate for work. And so he takes the job, he puts on the gorilla suit, he goes into the cage, and at first he's not real excited about it all, but the more he's there, the more he gets into it. And soon he's pretty enthusiastic, and the crowds are getting into it too, and he's really, really believable. They're buying it all. And one day he's swinging on vines, from side to side to side, and he's doing it so enthusiastically, he actually swings over the wall and goes into the cage next to his, which is where they kept the lion. And in an instant, the lion pounces right on top of him, and he can feel the hot breath of the lion in his face, and he just forgets everything. He forgets that he's playing a part. He forgets that he's dressed up, and in his desperation and his panic, he just starts to scream. He's like, help, 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 get me out of here. Somebody got to help me, and it surprised all the folks that are looking on to hear a gorilla scream such a thing. And then he hears a voice coming from the lion that says, hey, man, you got to shut up or stop screaming, or we're both going to get fired. Not one authentic creature in the whole zoo there, We live in a world where hiding, living behind masks, it's just standard operating procedure. And one of the incredible things about God is that he will allow it. He won't force himself on you. You must choose. But see, there's this pattern that's inevitable. Wrongdoing and sin always leads to hiding. It's just like the reflexive response we have. We hide. We do something wrong. You see this in kids all the time. We do something wrong, we sin, we feel guilt and shame, and our first instinct is to hide and pretend like we didn't do it. And hiding always leads to being alone. Sin always leads to hiding, to go up in a tree, and hiding always leads to aloneness. And you see it in Zacchaeus. There's this guilt and shame and deep inability to receive love. When you're hiding, you're unable to authentically receive love. And deep down inside, like even if you're fooling somebody and they do or say something nice, what's happening inside of you is you're saying, yeah, but if you knew the truth about me, you wouldn't love me. So there's this pattern of sin which leads to hiding, and aloneness and brokenness, and the destruction of community and intimacy. That burden can weigh so heavily on people that they'll do anything to get rid of the guilt. So let me ask you, for a moment, try to imagine that instead of Zacchaeus up in that tree, it's you up in that tree. And you really do want to see Jesus. I actually have a feeling that the grand majority of folks wouldn't be in this room today in here if you didn't have a longing to know God deeper. You have some measure of a desire to see Jesus. But the truth about you and me is there's also a part of us that's afraid to see Jesus, because we know that our lives, your life and my life, they don't measure up. And so imagine that you're in the tree, and you're half hoping that Jesus will see you, and you're half hoping that he won't. If Jesus were to come along right now and it was you up in that tree, The question is, what is it that Jesus would need to talk with you about today? What is it in your life that you are most likely to hide? What is it that you need to face up and come out of hiding about? Encountering Jesus on this Jericho road means that Zacchaeus must come down out of that tree and admit the truth about his life. He's got to admit it to Jesus. He's got to admit it to himself. And for Zacchaeus, he's got to admit it to a group of other people that he had wronged and hurt. You know, if you know anything about recovery programs, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous or the like AA or NA or something like that, a recovery program, if you know about them, you'll know that they have a step that goes something like this. They'll say, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. See, we face the truth about ourselves ruthlessly, and we just stop hiding. And part of the sickness in us is that we're willing to live with huge problems in our life as long as other people don't find out about them, and as long as we can hide them. See, people who are still trapped by their sin are more concerned with getting caught than getting help. Repentant sinners, sinners in recovery, are more concerned with getting help than getting caught. And if we'll be really honest about those two decisions, we'll find out a whole lot about the condition of our soul. You know, Zacchaeus is in the tree. He's carrying this burden around. He's hiding. And I want you to notice Jesus' approach here. If Jesus were just an ordinary, good, moral, religious teacher, then you'd expect him to say something like, Zacchaeus, like if you'll clean up your life, if you change professions, if you pay back what you owe, if you straighten things out, then I'll come to your house. I can't come now. I won't come now. It looked like I'm condoning you, and I can't do that. I can't afford the criticism it will cause my ministry. But if you clean up your life, then we can be friends. Then we can hang out. Then I'll go to your house. A lot of us have that approach to God. We think that's what he says to us. We think, I got to clean some stuff up, and then I'll come to Jesus. It doesn't work that way, and Jesus doesn't say that. He says, Zacchaeus, hurry on down because I must stay at your house today. Jesus always leads with grace. Whatever your secret is, you can trust him. Well, Jesus pays a considerable price for leading with grace. Like if you look at verse 7 there of Luke 19, it says, all who saw it began to grumble. And Luke goes out of his way to tell us that this response was widespread. It wasn't limited to one or two kind of negative people. All who saw it began to grumble. And they said, he's going to be the guest of a sinner. Now, that's a remarkable thing that happens here. Zacchaeus, who has happily, gratefully, joyfully received and welcomed Jesus, now all of a sudden realizes the truth about his life, his identity, his behavior are such that they'll dishonor Jesus. And I just can't go on. I mean, it's intolerable for him. He wants more than anything now to be connected to Jesus. He wants to know Jesus. He wants to honor Jesus. And he's not willing to, put up with anything remaining in his life that could threaten this intimacy with Jesus. And it turns out it's a real small sacrifice to him. Like a few moments before, before Jesus came down that road, his whole life was built on all the stuff that he had collected. He was willing to give up his reputation and his friendships and, his decency so that he could become a wealthy man, a dishonest man. And now all of a sudden he's ready to give up his wealth. Like the stuff that he had sacrificed his whole life for, he's ready to give it all up in a second for the sake of Jesus. Being in a close relationship with Jesus, being a follower of Jesus. See, for Zacchaeus now, that is suddenly worth the whole world. It's more important than anything. And so Zacchaeus here, he does an extraordinary thing. There's great, great wisdom in this in terms of spiritual development and growth and maturity. I want to point this out. Zacchaeus stood there and he says to the Lord, he does two things. He says, look, he does two things. I'll talk about the second half first. He says, if I've defrauded anyone of anything, then I'll pay him back 4 times as much. Now, he didn't have to do that. By law, Old Testament law said that if you cheated somebody, you just had to pay him back what you took from him with an additional 20%. But Zacchaeus, he goes way beyond that. And he says, I'll pay him back what I owe him times 4. That's how committed he is to make things right. And then he does this other extraordinary thing. He says, in addition to making things right with the people that I've wronged, I want to go way beyond that. I want to replace my old habit of greed with a new behavior of extravagant generosity. Like, in addition to what I'm going to give back, to restore to people, half of all my possessions now, he says, I'm giving to the poor. See, after this business of an honest examination of the truth about our lives, the next step we may think of in this process is removing and replacing. We may think of it that way: remove and replace, remove and replace, remove and replace. And the idea here is that I will ask God to remove what it is that I've been doing wrong and to remove this sinful habit that's got a hold of me. And not only that, but to replace it with the opposite virtue. And you see this all the time in the Bible. Like, for example, the Apostle Paul, when he writes to the church at Ephesus in the 4th chapter of Ephesians, he says not just to remove falsehood, but to replace it with truthfulness. Not just to remove bitterness, but to replace it with a forgiving spirit. Like, once you've acquired a bad habit, the only way to stop doing it is to start doing something else that's incompatible with it. Because it's infinitely harder to stop doing something than it is to start doing something. It's like a basic truth of spiritual life. For instance, if you have a problem with complaining, it's very difficult to say, tomorrow morning, I'm going to try hard to stop complaining. Instead, what's needed is to begin to cultivate the practice of gratitude. I'm going to start being thankful. If you have a problem with gossip, it's very hard to say, I'm going to stop gossiping. And instead, you got to cultivate the practice of affirmation or encouragement. Zacchaeus could have said, I'm still going to collect taxes, but I'm going to try real hard not to be greedy when I get around all that money. And probably what would have happened is that it would have been greed all over again. Instead, he says, I'm so motivated, I'm so hungry to live in the, as a follower of Jesus right now, that not only am I going to give up this greed, I'm going to cultivate the opposite virtue. I'm going to become an extravagantly generous person. Half of everything I've got, I'm going to give to the poor. Maybe the clearest sign of authentic repentance is when your number one goal is to set things right, and you'll do whatever it takes. You're kind of done with damage control. Like, the people that haven't yet reached a point of authentic repentance are sometimes people who may experience some pain over the wrong that they've done, but what they're really still trying to do is to minimize the damage of the pain that they feel. They're trying to do damage control. And the question is really, what do I have to do so I can quit experiencing pain? Zacchaeus, though, he was so gripped by the opportunity to be close with Jesus that he was willing to pay any price. He was willing to do whatever it took. In fact, he was so consumed with Jesus and a relationship with him and being close with him that it wasn't real painful for him at all. Like, if you were to put money on the one hand, and being a follower of Jesus on the other, being connected to Jesus and knowing Jesus on the other hand, it's just a no-brainer. It's just Jesus all the way, no matter what. The clearest sign of authentic repentance is not necessarily a deep emotional thing. Like, some people may have a very deep emotional experience, lots of tears and all that, but when the emotion goes away, there's no change. And other people may not have a deeply emotional experience, like they find themselves brought to the point where they say to Jesus with absolutely open hearts, I'll do whatever it takes, and there's nothing that's off limits to you. I'll make whatever changes I need to make through the guidance of your Spirit and with wise counsel and clear teaching from the Bible. I'll do whatever it is that I need to do so that I can be in an intimate connection with you and bring honor to your name. And that's what Zacchaeus does. At the end of this section here in verses 9 and 10, Jesus summarizes the whole deal. He looks at Zacchaeus and he says this: today, salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. Now Zacchaeus is a son of Abraham, a member of the children of God, not just like physically or genetically, but deep in his soul. And then Jesus says this to clarify his mission. Just like he did in Luke 5, he says, for the Son of Man has come to seek out and to save the lost. The truth about Zacchaeus is that he was lost. He was wretched and despised. He was filled with guilt. His life had been a waste. But he was only one sincere decision away from intimacy with God through his son Jesus that is priceless. He was as lost as it is possible to be, but he was that close to life in the kingdom of God. That close. I don't know what it is that's going on in your life. I don't know where you're tempted to hide, but I'll tell you this much. No matter how wretched that area of your life may be, no matter how big it feels, you're only one decision away. You're only one step away. Let's take a few moments. Let's think about this, reflect on this. Let's talk to God about it. We're going to celebrate communion where we acknowledge and thank God that he led with grace through Jesus and his death on the cross, his resurrection from the grave, so that we can be connected to him. That's why he did it. If you didn't get one of these individually wrapped packets of communion in the back, you can grab one of those now. Let's take a few moments. Let's thank God for Jesus. Now let's think about all this.